I thought it was just a glance, until her eyes held me. And suddenly, everything I believed about love, age, and desire felt impossibly wrong. The morning air carried a faint chill as I pushed open the door of the little bookstore I liked to escape to. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced lazily above the worn wooden floor. I had intended only to grab a coffee and a few minutes of quiet. Yet the moment I stepped in, everything shifted. She was there, sitting near the poetry section. A woman in her early 40s held a book with effortless grace. Her posture was relaxed but somehow commanding, a quiet confidence that seemed to slow time around her. Her hair, softly curling at the ends, fell across her shoulders, catching the morning light. And then her eyes, deep, warm, and impossibly magnetic, they met mine for the briefest second before she looked back at the pages. My chest tightened, a curious mixture of intrigue and hesitation washing over me. I told myself it was nothing, just a fleeting thought. People catch your attention sometimes. But my gaze kept drifting back. Something about the way she held her hands over the book, gently curling a finger around the corner of a page, made me feel like I was intruding on a private world I wasn't meant to enter. Yet I wanted to. The scent of her perfume, subtle, slightly floral, wafted across the small space and somehow settled in my chest, leaving a strange warmth that I couldn't shake. I noticed the way she shifted slightly in her seat, brushing her hair back behind her ear, and my own hand twitched unconsciously, as if reaching for an invisible connection. Every small movement she made carried weight, like a soft rhythm that my heart had unknowingly tuned into. I tried to focus on something else, scanning the shelves as if I were searching for a book I didn't really want. But there was no escaping the quiet pull she exerted. She laughed softly at something on the page, the sound light and unassuming, yet it lingered in my mind long after. I wondered if she knew, if she had any idea, how much that single laugh had unsettled me. Our eyes met again, this time just a flicker, but it was enough. Enough to ignite an unfamiliar awareness, a sense that this encounter, however ordinary on the surface, had the potential to change something inside me. I felt the tug of curiosity, fascination, and a quiet longing I hadn't anticipated. I left the bookstore that morning with nothing more than a coffee and a restless heart, the memory of her eyes following me through the city streets. I knew, in a way I couldn't yet name, that this was only the beginning. That one fleeting glance had done something impossible. It had unsettled my calm, and I was powerless to resist it. Days passed, yet her image remained lodged in my mind like a half-remembered dream that refused to fade. I found myself looking for her in the most ordinary places. My favorite cafe, the corner library, even the small park where I sometimes went to clear my head. And somehow, almost impossibly, she was there. The first time I saw her again, I almost didn't recognize her. She had a soft scarf wrapped around her neck, her hair pulled back loosely, and she was browsing the poetry section with the same effortless grace. My stomach tightened as our eyes met for a brief, fleeting moment. This time, there was something more. A glimmer of recognition, a quiet acknowledgement, though neither of us spoke. I tried to focus on a book, a cup of coffee, anything to distract myself, but I couldn't. My attention kept drifting back to the way she tilted her head, reading a passage, lips moving slightly as if tasting the words. There was a rhythm to her presence, subtle yet undeniable, like the pulse of a soft melody I couldn't stop humming. I noticed the small, intimate gestures that made her feel so alive. The brush of her fingers across the book cover, the way her shoulders shifted as she reached for a higher shelf, and the faint smile that flickered across her lips when a line of poetry caught her. Each movement was unremarkable on its own, but together they were magnetic. I felt my own breath catch, a flutter in my chest that I didn't know how to quiet. We began exchanging subtle acknowledgments, polite smiles, a nod here or there, the occasional shared glance across the cafe. Each small interaction felt like a heartbeat, a silent conversation that said more than words could. The age difference, which should have felt significant, faded into the background, replaced by the inexplicable pull between us. There were moments I caught myself imagining more. What it would be like to sit next to her, to feel the warmth of her presence close by, to hear her laugh just for me. But I always pulled back, unsure, hesitant, terrified that my fascination was too forward, too audacious. And yet, every time she left the room, a hollow ache followed, a quiet longing I couldn't shake. I began noticing how her presence changed the ordinary world around her. The sunlight on the cafe window seemed softer, the aroma of coffee more intoxicating, the rustle of pages somehow richer. It was as if the very air conspired to make her impossible to ignore. By the end of that week, I understood something I hadn't admitted to myself before. I was captivated, not just by her appearance or her smile, but by the quiet strength and subtle vulnerability she carried effortlessly. My thoughts lingered on her constantly, and each new encounter deepened a feeling I could no longer dismiss. And through it all, her eyes remained the same, magnetic, expressive, and alive. They held a story I longed to know, a depth that drew me closer with every glance. I couldn't yet reach her, not with words, not with touches, not with the courage I lacked, but I knew with an insistent certainty that I wanted to. It happened unexpectedly, as these things often do. I had convinced myself to keep a careful distance, to admire her from afar, to savor the quiet ache of curiosity without ever crossing the invisible line I feared. But life, as it tends to, had other plans. I was reaching for a book on the bottom shelf when I heard a soft, amused voice behind me. "Need a hand with that?" I looked up and found her standing there, her scarf slightly askew, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. My chest clenched as if the universe had pressed pause, leaving me momentarily frozen. I managed a nod, my hand fumbling with the book. "Thanks," I muttered, surprised at the raspiness of my own voice. She crouched slightly, lifting the book with an ease that made the movement seem effortless. "They always put the good ones down low," she said lightly, handing it to me. Our fingers brushed for a brief, fleeting moment, a spark that neither of us acknowledged aloud, but that lingered like a soft hum in the air. We moved toward the small reading table nearby, the tension between us growing in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. The first words were awkward, polite, the kind of small talk strangers exchange, but beneath them, there was a rhythm, a shared curiosity that neither of us could ignore. "I've seen you here before," she said finally, not accusingly, just noting. "You always seem absorbed in your books." I laughed softly, surprised by her observation. "I guess I am. It's easy to get lost here." My eyes couldn't help returning to hers. There was an intelligence there, a quiet attentiveness that made me feel both exposed and understood. And then, almost without realizing it, the conversation deepened. We spoke about favorite authors, fleeting interests, small anecdotes from our lives. She laughed at one of my clumsy attempts at humor, and I felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through my chest. It wasn't just attraction. It was connection, the kind that sinks beneath the surface before you even notice it happening. There were subtle, intimate gestures that punctuated the talk. She adjusted the sleeve of my coat, a light touch that lingered a heartbeat too long. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume, a comforting, floral warmth that seemed to wrap around me. Each glance, each pause, each almost touch became a quiet conversation of its own. And yet, we stayed careful. There was an unspoken understanding of boundaries, a shared hesitation that somehow made the moment feel more fragile, more precious. The age gap, though never spoken of, hovered quietly, reminding me of the tension that made every gesture feel charged, every glance feel weighted with meaning. When the conversation ended, it felt too soon. She smiled warmly, gathering her book, and for a moment, our eyes locked, heavy with a silent acknowledgement of the pull between us. The late afternoon sun cast a soft golden glow through the cafe windows, turning the quiet space into a sanctuary of warmth. We found ourselves sitting across from each other, a small table between us, yet somehow the world beyond seemed to fade. I watched her as she sipped her tea, the faint curve of her smile tugging at something inside me I didn't yet fully understand. Our conversation, which had begun lightly, gradually drifted into more personal territory. She spoke of her past with a gentle candor, revealing fragments of her life I hadn't expected, moments of regret, fleeting joys, the weight of decisions that had shaped her into the woman sitting before me. I listened, captivated, feeling the quiet gravity of her presence pull me closer, not physically, but in a way that settled in my chest and tightened my heartbeat. "I don't often share these things," she said, her eyes meeting mine for the first time in a long, unflinching gaze. "But somehow, it feels easier with you." The words struck me in a way nothing else had. There was trust there, delicate and fragile, yet unspokenly complete. I felt the urge to reach across the table, to bridge the gap with a touch, but I hesitated, conscious of the intimacy and the slow pace of what was unfolding. Still, my hand brushed briefly against hers when passing the sugar. Just a fleeting contact, yet enough to send warmth spiraling through my chest. I found myself sharing pieces of myself I rarely voiced aloud. My doubts, my small failures, the quiet yearning for connection that had been gnawing at me for months. She listened with the kind of patience that made me feel seen, truly seen, and it was intoxicating. The more I spoke, the more I noticed the small, intimate gestures that punctuated her attention. The tilt of her head, the softening of her gaze, the faint brush of her fingers against her lips as she considered my words. There was a moment of silence, not uncomfortable, but heavy with unspoken acknowledgement. Our eyes met across the table, lingering just a fraction longer than polite conversation allowed. I could feel the unvoiced pull between us, the tension of restrained desire tempered by mutual respect. It was as though every unspoken thought, every quiet longing, was suspended in that space between us. The light shifted, and the warm amber tones of the evening seemed to wrap around us, cocooning us in a world separate from the hum of the cafe. I noticed the subtle scent of her perfume, soft, floral, grounding, and the gentle rise and fall of her shoulders as she breathed. The simple act of being near her, of listening and sharing, became something profoundly intimate. By the time we parted, the quiet confessions had changed something fundamental between us. There was no grand declaration, no sudden spark of romance, yet everything felt irrevocably shifted. I walked away with the memory of her eyes, the warmth of our fleeting touch, and the understanding that this connection, delicate, intense, and unspoken, was only just beginning. In her presence, I had discovered not just attraction, but a rare, tender intimacy that words alone could never capture. And I knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified me, that I wanted more. The days after our quiet confessions were some of the most confusing I had ever experienced. Everywhere I went, I found myself thinking of her. The tilt of her head when she laughed, the warmth of her hand brushing mine, the depth of her eyes that seemed to hold entire stories I could only guess at. I tried to focus on work, on friends, on anything to distract myself, but it was useless. She had settled into my mind, and I was powerless to evict her. I wrestled with the conflict that came with these feelings. Part of me was exhilarated, thrilled by the connection that had begun to grow between us. Yet another part of me was terrified. The age difference hovered quietly in my thoughts, an unspoken warning that my attraction might be misplaced or socially complicated. I questioned myself constantly. Was I reading too much into the glances, the touches, the silences? Was my heart rushing simply because I was unprepared for someone like her to notice me, to let me in? It wasn't just fear, it was also desire. The desire wasn't physical in the way movies often portray it. It was quieter, more insistent. It lived in the anticipation of seeing her, in the lingering warmth when our hands brushed, in the way my chest seemed to tighten when she smiled or looked at me in that soft, knowing way. I felt it in my throat, my heartbeat, the restless energy that refused to settle. Every ordinary day became charged with the memory of her presence, every mundane moment tinged with longing. Sometimes, I would watch her from a distance, trying to gauge her mood, searching for clues in the subtle shifts of her posture, the way she interacted with others, or the small smiles she reserved just for me. I noticed the little things. How she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, how her gaze softened when she looked at me, how she laughed quietly when something amused her. Each observation was a revelation, a reminder that my feelings were real and not merely a projection of longing. And yet I held myself back. Every impulse to reach for her, to close the distance, was tempered by caution. I feared misreading the signs, crossing boundaries, or exposing the raw vulnerability that had taken root in me. The restraint was a double-edged sword. It kept me from acting rashly, but it also intensified the tension, making every fleeting glance, every accidental touch, feel electric. In these moments of solitude, I realized how unprepared I was for someone like her to affect me so deeply. She had become a quiet obsession, not one of lust, but of fascination and admiration, a magnetic pull I could neither resist nor fully comprehend. The internal struggle wasn't just about desire or propriety. It was about navigating a connection that was profound, fragile, and entirely new to me. By the end of the week, I understood one undeniable truth. I couldn't ignore her. I couldn't turn away from the pull I felt, no matter how uncertain it made me. The risk was high, and the consequences unknown. But the thought of walking past her one more time without letting her know how much she mattered seemed unbearable. The evening had a softness to it, a gentle hush that made the world outside seem distant. We found ourselves walking together along a quiet street, the streetlights casting a golden glow that reflected in her eyes. There was a calmness in her presence, a warmth that seemed to seep into me with every step. But beneath it, I could feel the tension, the quiet charge that had been building between us for weeks, ready to surface in the most subtle, intimate ways. We had ended up in a small park, the benches empty, the faint rustle of leaves accompanying the occasional chirp of a bird. She sank onto the bench, and I sat down beside her, leaving a careful space between us. Neither of us spoke at first. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was laden with possibility. I could feel her presence beside me, the gentle rhythm of her breathing, the warmth radiating from her shoulders, the soft brush of her coat against mine. Then, almost unconsciously, she reached out. Her hand brushed lightly against my arm as she adjusted her position, and the contact lingered a moment longer than necessary. My chest tightened at the sensation, a rush of warmth spreading through me. I realized then that this wasn't just attraction. It was connection, profound and undeniable. We began talking, first quietly, about trivial things. The crispness of the evening air, the soft glow of the lamps, the way shadows stretched across the ground. And yet, every word carried weight. Every glance seemed to say what neither of us could voice. She laughed softly at a comment I made, and the sound made my chest ache with a longing I could no longer deny. At some point, she turned slightly toward me, her shoulder brushing mine. The movement was casual, but it spoke volumes. I caught the faint scent of her perfume, soft and familiar, and felt the subtle warmth of her hand resting near mine. Our eyes met, and there it was, the unspoken acknowledgement of the tension that had been building for so long. There was curiosity, desire, hesitation, and trust all intertwined in that single, lingering gaze. She leaned back slightly, as if testing the boundaries of comfort, and I felt the magnetic pull stronger than ever. I wanted to reach out, to close the gap, to let her know how deeply I felt, but I waited, sensing that the moment required patience as much as courage. And then, almost imperceptibly, she rested her head briefly on my shoulder. It was a small gesture, fleeting, yet it shattered the careful restraint I had been maintaining. My heart pounded, and a quiet warmth spread through me, an affirmation of the connection we had been nurturing. We remained that way for a while, side by side, the world beyond the park fading into a blur. Every brush of our hands, every shared glance, every unspoken word heightened the intimacy without needing anything more. In that moment, I understood that the subtle, quiet closeness was the true turning point. It wasn't dramatic or explosive. It was tender, deliberate, and deeply emotional. It was the moment when restraint gave way to acknowledgement, when the slow burn of our connection became undeniable. And I knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified me, that nothing would ever feel ordinary again. The evening had settled into a quiet intimacy, the kind that made the world outside seem distant and irrelevant. We found ourselves walking slowly through a narrow lane lit by warm streetlights, the faint scent of winter blooms mingling with the crisp air. My hand itched to reach for hers, to close the subtle space between us, but I paused, savoring the tension that had been building for weeks. Finally, without a word, she brushed her hand against mine. It was tentative, almost shy, but the touch was enough. My fingers instinctively intertwined with hers, and a warmth spread through my chest that left me both exhilarated and serene. There was no need for grand declarations. Our connection had matured silently, slowly, over countless shared glances, soft smiles, and fleeting touches. We stopped near a small fountain, the gentle trickle of water providing a soothing rhythm. She turned to face me, and her eyes, those eyes that had held me captive from the very first glance, were softer now, filled with trust, understanding, and a quiet joy. I felt a lump in my throat, overwhelmed by the intimacy of the moment, and yet profoundly at peace. "I'm glad we didn't rush it," she said, her voice low and sincere. "Everything feels right this way." I nodded, squeezing her hand gently. "Me too. I didn't want it to be anything less than this." My voice faltered slightly, but she only smiled, as if she understood without words. There was a gentle pause, a shared silence that spoke volumes. I noticed the subtle details, the way the light caught the highlights in her hair, the faint rise and fall of her shoulders as she breathed, the warmth radiating from her presence. My thumb brushed the back of her hand, a simple, intimate gesture that seemed to seal our unspoken promises. We leaned into the quiet, side by side, shoulders touching. A soft laugh escaped her when I gestured awkwardly at a fountain sculpture, and I felt my chest swell with affection. It was ordinary yet extraordinary, the kind of small, tender moments that, over time, became the essence of connection. I realized then that the slow burn had reached its gentle climax, not through dramatic gestures or overt passion, but through the cumulative effect of subtle intimacy. The lingering glances, the brushed hands, the shared confidences, the trust that had been built one quiet moment at a time. As we continued our walk, I felt a serenity I hadn't known was possible. Her fingers remained entwined with mine, our steps unhurried, our hearts aligned. Every hesitation, every moment of doubt, every internal struggle I had wrestled with was now rendered insignificant in the warmth of her presence. By the time we parted for the evening, it was with a lingering hug, her cheek resting lightly against my chest, and my arms holding her with a tenderness that spoke of admiration, desire, and deep affection, all at once. I felt her heartbeat against mine, steady and sure, and in that simple human rhythm, I knew our connection was real, enduring, and beautifully ours. Walking home, I carried the quiet joy of knowing that love could be gentle, patient, and profoundly transformative. Her eyes had held me, my heart had lost control, and together we had found a place of warmth, trust, and tender intimacy, where every glance, every touch, and every shared silence mattered more than words ever could. If this story made your heart race and left you longing for more of these slow-burn, age-gap romances, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that tug at your heart. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced a connection that caught you completely off guard? And hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that reminds us how powerful, tender, and unexpected love can be.